Hey, CNF, Creative Nonfiction Podcast, greatest podcast in the world. Sponsored by Goucher College's Master of Fine Arts in Nonfiction. Goucher MFA is a 2-year, low residency program. Online classes let you learn from anywhere, while on-campus residencies allow you to hone your craft with accomplished mentors who have Pulitzer Prizes and best-selling books to their names. The program boasts a nationwide network of students, faculty, and alumni, which has published 140 books and counting. You'll get opportunities to meet literary agents and learn the ins and outs of the publishing journey. Visit Goucher.edu/nonfiction to start your journey now. Take your writing to the next level and go from hopeful to published. And Goucher's MFA for nonfiction. CNF is also brought to you by Bay Path University. Discover your story. Bay Path University is the first and only university to offer a no-residency, fully accredited MFA focusing exclusively on creative nonfiction. Attend full or part-time from anywhere in the world. In the Bay Path MFA, you'll find small online classes and a dynamic and supportive community. You'll master the techniques of good writing from acclaimed authors and editors, learn about publishing and teaching through professional internships, and complete a master's thesis that will form the foundation for your memoir or collection of personal essays. Special elective courses include contemporary women's stories, travel and food writing, family histories, spiritual writing, and an optional week-long summer residency in Ireland, with guest writers including Andre Debus III, Anne Hood, Mia Gallagher, and others. Start dates in late August, January, and May. Maybe May 2020. Find out more at baypath.edu/MFA. Go on. Look under your chairs. You get a riff. You get a riff. You get a riff. Welcome, CNFers. I'm Brendan O'Mara, and this is CNF, the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, where I talk to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I tease out origins. That's another word, orange. I always want to say oranges. Tease out origins and get to the heart about how these CNFers go about the work so you can improve your game. Today's guest is Stephen Kurutz at Kurtz on Twitter, SKURUTZ. He's a features writer for the New York Times, and he was the very, very first writer in creative nonfiction's amazing, and dare I say, its best product, true story. It's called Fruitland. Amazing. I think it's online somewhere. I'm pretty sure you cannot get it in hard copy anymore, but it might be like a long reads feature. Link in show notes if it's available. In any case, you have that to look forward to. Make sure you're subscribed to the show. I mean, why wouldn't you? Go do that wherever you get your pods. Keep the conversation going on Twitter at CNFPod and Instagram, also at CNFPod. This grows on the backs of your support. If you dig it, pass it along. And if you do, tag me in the show. I'll be sure to light you up with digital fist bumps and maybe an on-air shout-out like this. Thanks to Austin Pickens for supporting the show and reaching out on Twitter. It's fun having Metallica conversations. Means a lot. I got to thinking the other day that I've got to strip things down to the bones. Now, bear with me as I go through this little diatribe. I've been caught in this trap of trying to do it all and do too many things. The 40-hour work week day job, the 20-hour a week or so podcast, well, that's like reading, research, production, promotion, etc. Freelancing stories and columns, trying my hand at some content marketing writing, flirting with the idea of doing some dog photography, writing a kid's sports book for girls. I mean, it's a mess. Forget about the freaking memoir that I've been writing. It's no wonder nothing really gains traction or momentum. I suspect many of you might have the same problem. So once I'm done with some of my horse racing commitments and I'm done with this hippocamp talk that's given me anxiety up the wazoo, this is what I'm focusing on. The day job, because that's what keeps the lights on, and the podcast. I'm tabling the memoir, tabling all writing except my journaling, tabling all pipe dreams and shiny new ideas. This podcast is my squeaky Kong, filled with delicious peanut butter. This podcast, it needs to hit a new level, and it needs all of my attention. so I can deliver the best product to you and build what I hope is a ripe community. The other stuff will be there when it's ready. Kind of what got me thinking about this, I just put a little thing out on Twitter that said, like, baseball is pretty much the only thing I've ever really been good at, and especially hitting. And trust me, I was never a natural. I'm not a natural. I was a good ball player because it was all I cared about. It was all I focused on. And I thought about my guys, Metallica. And you know how those guys and countless other thriving musicians make it, right? It's not because they're geniuses, though some are. And I don't think the gods, the metal gods, somehow found 4 geniuses then they happened to meet in the same place in the same time. No, it's because in their spare time, they played guitar for 8 hours a day or more. And that's it. They went on tour in small clubs only so they could play maybe another small club, and then they would get their reps. It was that singular vision that they all shared. And some bands make it, and some writers make it, and fill in the blank. But the commonality among anyone who makes it is that singular vision. And I wanted to share that because maybe we're only as far away from our dreams and goals as our focus, or lack thereof. Now, I know you didn't ask for that little lecture, but it was on my mind, so I had to blurt it out. I understand there's a skip ahead, or like 15 or 30 seconds on your podcast app. You can feel free to use it. Anyway, Steve Kurutz is here, Stephen Kurutz, and he's got a great story about how he became a writer and how he found his way to writing features for the best damn newspaper in the country. Before we get to him, though, I just want to give one more shout-out to River Teeth, the literary journal, for the promotional support. You boss. Okay, now, it's finally time for the show. Let's kick it. Fruitland and then some other essays that you've written, so this will be fun, and I know you've got a particularly... I always love charting how a writer becomes a writer, and especially when they have sort of they don't necessarily have like a classic sort of literary background. In an essay you wrote, like your father preferred to work with his hands, and as you wrote in one essay, you said, my mother, when confronted with anything text heavy, would raise a palm in resistance and say, "I'm not a big reader." So I'd love to say, how did a reader and a writer come out of that parental dynamic?
I don't know, other than it was a bit innate, I guess. I've been around enough writers and been a writer long enough. I think there's a writer disposition. The writer disposition is somebody who is just more comfortable on the sidelines watching things. You just gravitate to that kind of role. You're not necessarily the person who's just quickly participating, but you're sort of you're always kind of looking at life at a bit of a remove. I have that personality, and I think probably early on when I started reading books, I must have recognized that in the other authors, and also just the act of reading kind of takes you out of the Sturm and Drang of life, and you're a bit on the sidelines and contemplative and thinking about things. But I have to say, in fairness to my mother, and I think maybe I put it in that essay, my mother and my father were big magazine subscribers. So there were a lot of magazines in my house growing up. My dad was into trains, so there were train magazines, and my mother liked houses and architecture, so they were decorating magazines. But later on, when I got to New York and ended up working in magazines, and doing a lot of magazine writing, it just somehow, looking back on it, I was like, oh, this feels natural and this makes sense. I grew up in a house teeming with magazines, and now I'm, working in a magazine.
I love how you came to the library and kind of revered the library growing up as a way to seek the outside world without actually having to outwardly engage with it as you can, because you don't have the means or to get out into the world. But the books, specifically like Cannery Row, was very influential for you. So like, how important was that? Like, take us to your childhood library and how important that place was for you as you were developing that sort of writerly disposition, as you say.
It was huge, and I should just put this in some context. in terms of where I grew up, I grew up in a very small 1,500 people, one stoplight town in central Pennsylvania, and it's not just a small town. It's a small town plopped in the middle of thousands of acres of state forest preserves. So it's a very remote, insular place. Like the nearest bookstore was 50 miles away. The nearest record store was, 30 or 40 miles away. The nearest mall, all that sort of stuff. And it's in the middle of the state. So it's 3.5 hours to Pittsburgh and 3.5 hours to Philadelphia. So you're not really around the city. So in that environment, and then also, in an environment where very blue collar and it's not a literary type environment. A place like the library was just hugely important. And my mother, early on when I was little, they had these children's reading classes, and she enrolled me in those. I just sort of caught the bug, and I spent a lot of time there. And it was the kind of place I wrote an essay about this library, where again wasn't like it was a big reading community. So I would go in there, and you just have the place virtually to yourself, and it felt like it was your own library. You walked in, and there was on the left, if you went, there were two rooms, and then in the middle there was the librarian's desk. On the left-hand side, the left room was a children's reading room. The right-hand side was the adult reading room. And, when you were 12 or 13, you got to pass from the children's reading room to the adult reading room. You weren't allowed to go in there, until you were a teenager. And so just that experience and just being in there completely alone. And I still go back there, my folks are there, and I visit a lot, and I enjoy going to the library. And again, it's just that adult room was just one room of books. It wasn't like you were going to find the deep cuts, you know what I mean? Or even more metropolitan, cosmopolitan writers like Philip Roth. You weren't likely to find that, but you would find the three classic books by Hemingway and The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald, and then Shakespeare. It had all the kind of classics that you needed, to get maybe one Dostoevsky book. So you could get an education, a literary education that by going there.
At what point did you start to think that this was a vocation that you wanted to take up?
Well, when I got to college, I did major in English. I went to Penn State, the big state school, and there was some way the major worked where you could put an emphasis on something. So my emphasis was on fiction writing, creative writing. And I did it there. I got some encouragement in high school from an English teacher, and then I got some encouragement in college from a teacher. But I was pretty directionless. Again, when you come from an environment where there really not very many people have ever gone to college and then gone out into the sort of professional world or been away to cities, and worked and lived there. It's all completely foreign. So I had no understanding of how to get a job as a writer or a magazine or any of those things. So I really, after I graduated, I had this degree in English, and I kind of floundered because I didn't know how to make that transition from college life into the professional, working world. What happened was I threw resumes everywhere, and by chance I got an internship at Entertainment Weekly magazine in New York City, and the internship paid $8 an hour. And that allowed me, I had a little bit of savings from working jobs in college that allowed me to move to New York. And then suddenly, I was made aware of this whole world of publishing and magazines and the career path. And I think that's really when things kicked in. Before that, I sort of had these half-baked notions that I was going to play music or something, which I'm not very good at. I would have, it would have been sort of disastrous. Once I got to New York, I didn't even know about the New Yorker magazine until I got to New York. And then when I got to New York and learned about these other magazines, and a magazine like the New Yorker just became a Bible for me. And again, sort of like the library, it just opened up this entire world where it's like, oh, all these amazing writers that have published in here over the years. And, I love the tone of the magazine and the level of quality and the book reviews and just the whole literary thing. And then kind of got the ambition to really do it, I would say, a year or two after being in New York, and I've been doing it since.
Who were some of the writers, as you started picking up the New Yorker, that you were reading? They were like, oh my God, like turn the world kind of black and white into color for you.
I have to say, it really was the totality of the magazine, everything. Mm-hmm. The short, the talk of the towns, these quick 800 humorous, 800 word stories that are often funny or charming in some way, to the features. But, at that time, Susan Orlean, was a big one, and Alec Wilkinson. And then I went and got all these, bought all these books that Alec Wilkinson had written and read those, Calvin Trillin, Tad Friend, and then, learning more about the history of it, E.B. White and, these other writers. I'm looking at my bookshelf, and I have that amazing book, Portrait of Hemingway, that grew out of a New Yorker by Lillian Ross, so it's basically an extended New Yorker profile of Hemingway, and it's just incredible, like these are John Hersey, Hiroshima. These books are just amazing, and these writers are amazing. And for a long time, the New Yorker really was, I was getting an education through reading it.
And looking at your bio, of course, you write for New York Times and New York Times Magazine, features reporter, and for a lot of people who listen to the show, and myself included, like that to me is like such a gold standard of a place to do the kind of writing you do, and a lot of the writing that just we desire and we read. When you look at that, it sometimes feels like to get there, you are somehow anointed. And I know that's not true. And so you started as the intern at Entertainment Weekly, and I'd love to just maybe chart how you got to where you are today and some of those growing pains and early lessons you learned. So from Entertainment Weekly, how did you start building some momentum that ultimately would put you on the path where you are today?
Okay, so I was at Entertainment Weekly in '99. I came to the city in the winter of '99, and the internship lasted 6 months. And I met some friends there, and got excited about magazines and just But even still, again, I had these half-baked notions. So I spent that summer of '99 interning in a recording studio, which was unpaid. And I, got coffee for bands, thinking maybe I would try to couldn't decide music or magazines or publishing. I didn't like working in a recording studio. I didn't like the environment. And so then I just started, I temped for over a year and a half, maybe. I temped in just various offices in the city. I don't know if temping is still the same robust industry as it was at the time, but it was really fascinating. You'd be in one office for 3 days and then you'd be somewhere else and all over the city. And I did that. And at the same time I did that, I started freelancing. I placed a couple pieces in Salon back then, and a few small pieces in Entertainment Weekly magazine based on the contacts that I had there. And then eventually one of the editors that was at Entertainment Weekly went to Details magazine, a men's magazine that's gone now, that was kind of like GQ or Esquire, and it was being revamped at the time. He reached out. I think he reached out, or maybe I pitched him a story, and he said there was an opening. So it was an editorial assistant opening. I got the job. So that was my first full-time job. No, actually, it wasn't my first full-time job. Before that, I got fired from Time Out magazine. I got hired to be a music critic for Time Out magazine, which at the time, Time Out magazine. It was like this place where if you were an up and coming writer, you worked in the trenches at Time Out, and then you eventually went to Time or the New York Times or some other place because it was very fast paced, and you got to learn the ropes and learn the city. I flamed out after 6 weeks or something. It was just a terrible fit, between my boss and I, and I don't know. I really basically got fired because my depth of indie rock knowledge wasn't really where it should have been. And, I remember specifically, I didn't know who some person named Momus was. And it was like, you don't know Momus? That's it. You're out. I still really don't. 20 years later, I still don't know who Momus is, but it was devastating for me at the time to get this magazine job, and I'm flying by the seat of my pants in New York and stuff, and still just sort of barely making it. And then now I'm unemployed again. Then I got this job at Details, and that was great. And that was the first job that allowed me to, travel for a story, like you're an editorial assistant, you're doing some kind of secretarial managerial stuff, but then if there's extra things they need you to write, they write them. They had this column, a Q&A every month. I got to interview Elton John, which was an amazing thing. And then I eventually took the column over and interviewed a big prominent older celebrity. The column was called Wise Guy. So I got to do that. I flew to Miami to report a story about a race car driver. It was a really great experience. However, you're right. Like the Times is the place, if, the New Yorker and the Times, these are really the places to do amazing writing and the kind of writing I wanted to do. At a magazine, it's formatted, you have like the celebrity on the cover that sells it, and then you have the various formatted type stories, and each magazine has its own demographic that it's trying to appeal to. And if you find a story that's outside that demographic, it really isn't a fit for the magazine. And I have always been a generalist. It was being limited by, okay, you've got to find sort of like the 25 to 35-year-old guy who's doing something cool in some industry, and write that story month after month. I just didn't. It was frustrating after a certain point. So I started freelancing for the Times for this section called the City section that doesn't exist anymore, but it was very much like the New Yorker. It covered the city. It was a weekly in a very literary way. It was like Joseph Mitchell, that kind of, that kind of writing where you roam the city and you write about interesting characters in different neighborhoods. Started freelancing for them, and then a position opened up, and then I got the position. The position was not a full-time staff position at the Times. It was, the city section had 5 or 6 contract writers. You got a certain amount every month, so you did get a stable paycheck, but it was not an avenue into the paper. It was a really amazing job. My job, each of us had different neighborhoods around the city that we were assigned to cover, and my neighborhood was Manhattan below 14th Street. I mean, it's just like the epicenter of cool, for the city, for the country, if not the globe. And I was covering those neighborhoods, the East Village and the Lower East Side and Soho and all that stuff. So it was an amazing job, but it was not an avenue into the paper. And I know this answer is long-winded, but I'll wind it up, which is that, okay, so I did that job for 3 years, but I was getting close to 30 at the time, and I had no health insurance. So I thought, like, I can't continue to do this. So eventually, even though I love the Times, it was like dating a girl who's never going to marry you. You just, at some point, you have to be like, okay, I know you're beautiful, but I have to, I have to move on. And I got a full-time job at the Wall Street Journal. And I was there for a couple of years, covering arts and books and things like that. And I didn't expect it to ever happen, but a position opened up at the Times, and it was for a section, the home section, that I had been freelancing for while I was doing city stuff. And the editor knew me and I got the job. And then, after a number of years of freelancing, basically for the Times, I became a staffer at the Times, and that was in 2011.
That's amazing. I love that. It's like there was something that you really wanted here, and the door wasn't necessarily open, but you kind of kicked it open just enough so you could always be on the forefront of these people's minds. And you did the work, you did good work, so that when the time came, when there was an actual position that could hire you, it was like you had done the work and proven yourself, and you ran with you did what you could with what was offered to you at the time, and then it definitely paid off by 2011. So that just speaks to like your rigor and tenacity to kind of play the long game, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, I don't know. I didn't know if I was playing a long game at the time. Like, I was just probably in my 20s, and the world was new to me, and being in New York. But the rigor and tenacity is certainly true. I mean, it's probably cooler to say that, I can pick up a story and report a story and open a laptop and just write it and it flows out. That's just not the case. That entire decade of my 20s was educating myself about good writing, trying to get better at writing myself, trying to get to venues that would allow me to do the writing that I really wanted to do and the stories that I really wanted to do, learning from lessons, mistakes I had made, just reading constantly, just really falling in love with it. And, and the city section, it was a weekly, and you had to produce. And so there was nothing like the joy of, and there still isn't anything like the joy of when you just reported a story and now you're sitting down to write it and, like shaping it and sculpting it and all that sort of stuff. I did spend all those years and a lot of that time focused on really one thing only, and that was writing and getting better at it.
When you were starting out there in that turbulent decade, and you're writing and reporting, what were shortcomings you noticed in your own skill set that you felt like you needed to really, work and practice and research and, and put in the repetitions on the tee, or like as a musician and someone who writes a lot about music, learning your scales? Like, what were some of the things that you were struggling with that you eventually got better through practice and repetition?
I think at the time, I remember, because I had started and I did work at my college paper, and that's what got me my senior year. I worked at the college paper, and that's what got me the internship at Entertainment Weekly. But at that time, the college paper pieces were short. Entertainment Weekly, they're a feature story. Maybe it's like 2,000 words at the most. And then you had all these little 150-word stories. And I loved doing them because they had to be as tight as haiku. I mean, the magazine had a fleet of editors and copy editors. So it's just because it's a 150-word story doesn't mean, like you knocked it off. It was almost harder in some ways to write a 150-word story, but even Time Out was small. And then the city section, they had these things that were called neighborhood reports that were 400 or 500 words. And then if you did a cover story, maybe a cover story was 1,800, 2,000, all of which is to say the thing that in those years for me was the difficult, challenging thing was length. I would just look at a New Yorker story or a New York Times magazine story that was 5 or 6 or 10,000 words and just be amazed. And it was all about, I don't know, it's like working up, for me it was at least, maybe some writers just start out writing long and big features. But for me, it was like working up to like, okay, you're hitting balls in the infield, and now you can get some balls into the outfield, and then you're capable of putting a ball, over the fence in a home run. So like, that was the struggle for me of a 3,500 word story just seemed, monumental, to try to report and write and figuring out all that information and where does it go and how do you, the amount of reporting that's involved in writing a 10,000 word piece. So that was something that it took me many, many years to be doing, like Fruitland, which was a true story for creative nonfiction. That was a 10,000 word piece. I haven't written many 10,000 word pieces. I did write a book years ago. So you could say, yes, I, wrote long, but even still, to write that long and to do the depth of reporting is still, I always kind of take a pause. It's like you're, to use another metaphor, it's like you're climbing Everest or something, and you're like, okay, one step at a time.
Yeah, that's. I think a lot of people, and I lump myself into this. You think that writing anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 words it's a matter of just like squeezing the words out, but really I think people maybe undervalue might be the wrong word, or they underestimate the amount of research and reporting goes into something of that length. And actually, when you're writing 5,000 or 10,000 words, it's like that's the shortest possible version of that story if you've done it well. And the massive reporting you have to do, people might not realize how much there is. Like, did that surprise you? Like, as you were trying to write pieces of this nature, like Fruitland, that the research and the reporting was like nothing you had ever done before?
Yeah, especially early on, because I think, and you're totally right. I mean, I think what happens is that when you're early on in writing, you wish you had more space. You're like, man, this is I have so much to say about this. If they just give me 5,000 words and, I only have 1,000 to say it, but you can't do 1,000. You can't do enough reporting for 1,000 words and then try to stretch it into 5,000 words. Because what happens is, as you're going along, it's like, it feels really thin. You know what I mean? It's like you're making soup with no hearty ingredients, and you just got this weak broth. And when you're really young as a writer and starting out, you think your voice is going to get you the other 4,000 words. It's like, oh, well, I can just riff. And some people can riff. Some people are good at riffing and they're stylists. I'm not one of those people. And so, yeah, I mean, you see a piece that's 5,000 or 10,000 words, that reporter may have spent 3 or 4 months on it. Like, they may have done enough reporting that really they could have written a book, and it's a 10,000 word piece and not a book. But, and then when you get into books, which was my ambition for a long time and is still, I've written one book. I hope I'll be able to write more. The amount of reporting that goes into a book is just like, boxes and boxes full of reporting. And again, maybe there's someone who can just kind of riff a book out, but for most people, and if you wanted to really have the heft that a great story has, you can't do that. You really have to do a lot of reporting.
I know a shortcoming that I've experienced the last few years that I'm trying to get over is that notion of style. Sometimes when you read someone like a David Foster Wallace or Chuck Klosterman or people of that nature who are so definitively strong on the page, as maybe an insecure and a developing writer, you're like, I want to do that. I want to be like that. I want to be recognizable at the first power chord. Like, oh, that is this band. That is this writer. So of late, for me, it's been showing the restraint and let the story do the heavy lifting. And that's something I noticed with your work. Like, it has such a nice rhythm to it. Like, Fruitland reads so well, and you know that you're laying your work at the feet of the story, and you're showing that narrative restraint and letting the story do the heavy lifting. Was that something you had to consciously learn over the years, to kind of show that restraint and let the story do all the heavy lifting?
Well, yes and no. And again, I know you're totally right. And I know what you're saying. I mean, there are some books that are almost dangerous in terms of being influential, because you fall in love so much with the writer's voice that you want to do that. There was for me, there was this writer, Bruce J. Friedman, who was mainly a novelist in the 60s, contemporary of Philip Roth, 60s and 70s. But he also did nonfiction writing, and this collection of his book, of his nonfiction, came out in the late 90s, early 2000s, right when soon after I got to New York and was discovering all this stuff. It's called Even the Rhinos Were Nymphos. And it's a little bit like Klosterman, where he just has a really comic, fresh, unique take on things. It's very voicey. He can do really smart, nuanced thoughts on things, but at the same time tell a joke. And that book was just like, it was dangerous for me, because then I spent the next couple of years just trying to write Bruce J. Friedman stories, Even John Jeremiah Sullivan, that book,
Right.
Pulphead, which I absolutely love. I mean, I take that book down off the shelf a lot, but it's like, if I took that book down off the shelf at 24, it would have been too powerful for me. Like
Right.
now I know to take certain things out of it, like structure and other things, and leave certain things behind, because he has a very singular, amazing, fly off the page voice. And I don't have that. But the other thing is that, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the fact that I was so enamored with the New Yorker, where the New Yorker has an institutional voice, but it, like Chuck Klosterman, it wouldn't publish in the New Yorker. Maybe he has, I don't know. I don't want to assume things, but it just, like, if Chuck Klosterman would have started his career at the New Yorker, he wouldn't have been Chuck Klosterman, because they would have beaten him down and kind of taken that voice away. So, but the New Yorker, one of the great things about it is that it's more about the story than about the voice. It has this kind of institutional voice. A lot of it, is very understated. Susan Orlean, is a pretty voicey writer, and she made a career at the New Yorker. So there are exceptions, but generally speaking, what I learned to appreciate was the cleanness of the prose and the insight of the thinking of the writer. That's what was venerated in those pieces and at that magazine. And so then I wasn't a person who was screaming of, like, I have this very unique voice and I have to get it out. Like, I idolized reporters who were a little more in the background and let their voice, there's other ways that voice comes out too. I mean, that's the other thing. Like, voice comes out in what you choose to write about. That's a big part of voice. Voice comes out in what you choose to say, what you don't say, how you structure a story. I wouldn't call John McPhee necessarily a hugely voicey writer. Or I mentioned that book, Hiroshima, by John Hersey. I mean, it's not a first-person piece. I don't know if he even appears in it, but you understand his point of view, his morality, where he chooses to place the tension of the story. All those things are voiced too, but they're just voiced in a subtler way that doesn't, to like you said, it's not like the first power chord and immediately.
I haven't heard that articulated that well before, that sometimes voice just comes through the subject matter that you're just really excited about. And McPhee is a perfect example. He's a hero of mine. He's why I love and write and try to sell narrative journalism pieces and write narrative journalism books. He likes really sort of on the surface kind of boring topics, but there's no doubt that he is excited about it, and even though he's a pretty understated writer, there's plenty of voice there that comes through the things he's very interested in, whether that's oranges, canoes, or lacrosse. And I love that. Like, how did you come to recognize that as a something that is voicey, but not like pyrotechnically voicey, if that makes any sense?
I don't know. I mean, I just at some point over time. Let me take that back. at a certain point after I'd been doing this for a while, I've been doing it for 20 years. So after I've been doing it for a while, either a friend of mine, a fellow writer, or, occasionally an editor, someone would say, this feels like a story that you would do, or I've read about this something, or, sometimes happens to me, people that are not in journalism and writing aren't as byline focused as people that are in writing. So if it's just like your uncle who's reading the New York Times, or your aunt or something, they're just reading the article and they're not really paying attention to who's writing it. So frequently what would happen is someone would be like, it would be a close friend of mine or somebody, family member or something. And they'd be like, I read that piece in the Times. Oh, and then I realized afterwards you wrote it. And I was like, oh, of course you wrote that story. Because I wasn't conscious, but I just gravitate to certain subjects. And my spin on certain subjects is unique to me, just like your spin on a subject would be unique to you. So when you write long enough, and if you write in one place, like I have with the New York Times, or, you get an association with someplace, then other people may even recognize things about you that you don't realize. Oh, do you notice that you often do these kinds of stories, or you like protagonists that are such and such, or you like stories where this happens or whatever. So I think it was probably a combination of people saying to me, that feels like your kind of story. And that's how I got Fruitland. A friend of mine heard about the album and said, this feels like you. You should pursue this and do something. So it's a combination of that and a combination of just my own realization of, okay, I'm not a pyrotechnic person here in terms of voice, but I can put myself across the page in another way by the kinds of things. The world is just vast, and there's a vast amount of information, and how you filter it can be unique to you. What you take in and what you choose to write about, that can be your voice.
Yeah, and with Fruitland, it was published as Creative Nonfiction's very first true story imprint, which I do from the moment they release these things. I love them. I love that you can fit these things in your back pocket and mark them up and everything.
I know.
They're so cool. And so you were number one. You were batting leadoff. I wonder how you as a writer and a writer of a certain platform, of course, with being able to write for the Times or Times Magazine, how do you sometimes choose where something you want to write ultimately ends up being published? So, why was Fruitland a good fit, say, for a true story submission versus maybe trying to shoehorn it elsewhere?
Well, I did try to shoehorn it elsewhere. Full disclosure.
Yeah.
That story is has a little bit of a unique backstory, which is that I wrote it first, because I'm at the Times. My first inclination with every story is it's a New York Times story. And also because the Times, unlike, a magazine that has a specific demographic or a specific commercial market that they're going after, the Times is a great place for a generalist because there's the sports desk and the business desk and the magazine and styles and the book review and all these different components. So it's pretty much any story can fit somewhere within the Times. So I was writing for the home section of the Times at the time. And a really important thing in the late 70s in rural Washington, these two brothers, Donnie and Joe Emerson, recorded an album, self-recorded an album on their farm. And, the album went nowhere, because they had no connections to the record industry and they were living in the middle of nowhere. And it just sat in their basement and a few copies got out in the world. It just so happened that 30 years later, one of those copies, a music blogger found it in kind of like a junk, like a bric-a-brac shop in Spokane, Washington, and bought it and played it and fell in love with it. And it's a really amazing, unique album. And it just caught on in this underground world of people who were into what are called private press records, self-recorded, self-released music, and it became a kind of minor sensation. And songs that are on that record have shown up in movie soundtracks, and they've been covered by other artists and things now. But anyway, and there's many layers to the story. That's kind of like the quick version. But place was really important to that album. I mean, the fact that they recorded in pretty much total cultural seclusion. Donnie and Joe did not even have a record player in their farmhouse. They never saw a concert. They had a radio in a tractor, and they listened to the radio in the tractor, and that was it. So the fact that place and home was so important to that, I was like, oh, okay, I can make this work as a home story. And I did. I wrote as much as I could at the time, like 2,500 words or something in the home section. But the story, there's just so much more there. And I had to kind of shoehorn it a little bit to play up this home angle and to make things work. And it just didn't sit with me. This was like an amazing, amazing story, and I did not feel that I hit it out of the park. And you don't get, you get good stories, you can get good stories, but to get to get a story this rich, and then, it doesn't come along that often. And then to feel like you sort of, you didn't do it full justice, it just sort of ate at me. And I was like, all right, you know what? For my own satisfaction, I'm going to do the story the way I want to do it. Mm. And I went back out there. I spent more time on the farm, more time with Donnie and Joe. I did more reporting. And then things had happened in the course of that year with them because the album had got rediscovered, and it brought up a lot of emotional ghosts for the family and for Donnie, because, he made this music as a teenager, and a lot of water had gone under the bridge in all those years. And then Donnie and Joe came to New York City and did this amazing live show, which was just an incredible experience. So I had all this other material that I didn't have at the time I had reported it for the paper. And so then I wrote a 10,000 word version, and 10,000 words it wasn't a 30,000 word story. It wasn't, a 5,000 word story. It was a 10,000 word story. I didn't have any word restrictions, but when I finished it, and when Hattie Fletcher, the editor at True Story, and I were done with it, like, that's what it ended up being. And that was the right amount to tell that story with the right way. So that's how that happened. But in terms of like where it would go, or how do I choose where a story goes, 99% of the time for me, it's going in the New York Times, and the writing I do personal on the side. There aren't many places who are going to give you 10,000 words. The magazine industry has imploded. A magazine like Esquire, maybe at one time, or Vanity Fair or something. And also, as great as Fruitland was as a story, it probably wasn't sexy enough for Vanity Fair, and I don't have connections at the New Yorker. And then also, it had been previously, I did do a version of the story for the New York Times. So, no magazine would want to, they might say, okay, well, we don't want to take this because a version of this is already out, even though the two versions are just, they're completely different. But so in that case, it was like, okay, who's printing 10,000 word stories still? And it was, literary magazines. And so I sent it to Creative Nonfiction. Things just happened to work out. They were launching True Story. And these True Stories, as you say, they're really incredible. It's like a mini magazine. You're right. It's like, it's portable. It's not online. You can get it as a digital download, but it's kind of like, it's a harkening back to print. It reminds me of, those paperback books that, GI, they sold to GIs in the 1940s and 50s or something. It's, it really respects print and that idea of sitting down with something. So it worked out. It worked out really well. But in most cases, I would say it's literary magazines are the places to do long form writing like that.
Mm. Do you think Fruitland connected with you on an almost visceral level because of the place and the setting, given that you kind of grew up in a very small remote town, and then these guys, of course, grew up in a small remote town. Do you think that connection really sort of expressed itself and why you were so interested in this story in the first place?
Yes, absolutely. But I didn't know that at the time. I think I going back to what we were talking about before about the kind of topics you choose as a voice, I often write about underdog stories. And that, underdog can be a very broad kind of thing, but I'm just drawn to those kind of stories. So initially, the reason a friend of mine said this sounds like something you'd be into, and the other thing I tend to write about is the past and how to kind of reconcile the past with the present, and matters of nostalgia and matters of things kind of fading away and dying as new things as the world moves forward. I've been doing a lot of that at the Times lately. For example, the retail world is imploding, and then I went and did a story in Philadelphia about this place that's the last great men's clothing store, department store in America, called Boyd's. And that's just my kind of story, because they're underdogs. Like the world's crumbling around them, but they're finding some way to hold on and to thrive in this changing landscape. And they have to figure out how to bring the past into the future. So those kinds of things initially interested me about Fruitland, and that's why a friend suggested to me. It wasn't until I got out there and went to Fruitland, Washington, and met the Emersons and saw how remote and what kind of cultural isolation they had lived in, that, to your point, it resonated on a really deep level because of where I grew up and my own kind of cultural education, and trying to, when you grow up in a place like that, it's just like that world is so far from you, it's so far removed. And I live in cultural abundance now in New York City, and you're talking about no band is ever coming within 100 miles of 200 miles of your town, and there is no bookstore, there is nothing like that. So you have to figure out where you're going to get it. And you become really kind of like, when you become like a miner for gold. When you do find it, it's all that much more powerful, and it's like, oh my God, like there's this place, and they've got like records, you know what I mean? It's like, this is incredible. I didn't think I'd find, this book in this out of the way location, that sort of thing. So, and Donnie, all he had was the Lawrence Welk show on television. And he was telling me about, like, you'll think this is corny, but I asked him, I was like, well, what were your influences if you didn't have a record player and stuff? He was like, I watched Lawrence Welk on TV. He was like the squarest person in America you could even think of, but it was a musician on television, and they were playing music, and it was coming into his living room in the middle of nowhere. Those were the things that I really responded to, once I got out there and spent time with him. Also for Donnie, just like the other issues about trying to resolve the past and figuring out what part of the past you take with you to your present day life. He was struggling a lot with that when there was all this attention put on this album that he had done when he was 16 years old, and now he's a 50-year-old man and very far removed from that time and place. And
in your own work and over the course of your career, oftentimes, especially as you're developing and trying to get a toehold, sometimes you start playing the comparison games and the comparison Olympics, and you look over your shoulder, and sometimes you wonder how so-and-so did this. I feel like I'm every bit as good as this person, and I'm like kind of in the mud, and they're up here. So I wonder, like, how maybe you've processed feelings of competition or jealousy over the course of your career, and maybe channeled that into a more productive way of moving, so you can kind of get the work done and do the wonderful work you've been able to do for going on 2 decades.
Yeah, I think I had those feelings more so when I was in my 20s. Really, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Is it just youth or ambition or what? I had more of those. I think. Okay, like I did this book years ago, like that came out in 2008 on tribute bands. I followed around this Rolling Stones tribute band. And so my thing was always like, I want to write a book so bad. And look at this person. They got a book deal. And I didn't get a book deal. And that sort of thing. And then I wrote a book. And the book came out. And I was very happy with it. But it didn't change my life. You know what I mean? Like there was someone else then who had written 3 books. Right. Or someone else was on to their next book. So you look at those things and you realize that at a certain point, and also we're talking at a time when the industry is like, frankly, just like imploded. So that kind of stuff, like when I first came up in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was like, well, you work at Time, but the people who work at Condé Nast are like higher up on the totem pole than the Time people. But the New York Times, it's like there was all this like, where are you on the ladder and where are you on the totem pole? And it's like, oh, this author got, this $500,000 advance and this happened. And it's like, we're all now in an industry where you're just fighting to live. You're just fighting to hold on, and magazines have closed and other magazines are just sort of shells of themselves. And maybe they're still giving out huge book advances occasionally, but I don't know. And so it's not really even about that. You realize at a certain point, it's about the work. The only thing that's going to give you the sense of satisfaction is if you told the story you wanted to tell and you did it the best way you could and you're satisfied with the result. The satisfaction comes, truthfully, in seeing it in print. And yes, you want to see it in a place that's prestigious or gets the most eyeballs or whatever, but really it's just about it existing. That's the satisfaction, because there's not monetary, you're not going to get rich off of it. The great majority of people aren't. Even people who've published 10 or 20 books, maybe they have problems publishing the 21st or whatever. All that kind of stuff is really just noise, and it takes you away from the task at hand. And the task at hand is finding a good story and being present and telling that story, and then finding a good home for that story, and then learning from that experience and moving on to the next story.
Nice, huh? He's at S. Kurutz on Twitter, SKURUTZ. My volunteer editor said she couldn't find much to cut from this episode, so that's a testament to a killer guest, am I right? Keep the conversation going on Twitter. Tag me and the show at CNFPod. We'll get the band back together, man. Also, consider leaving a nice review on Apple Podcasts. Mission 100 is still in effect. Let's get there. Let's get there, CNFers. Thanks to Goucher's MFA in Nonfiction, Bay Path University's MFA in Creative Nonfiction, and River Teeth for the support. Thanks also to Laura Tillman, who edited the interview portion of this show. Big ups. Could that possibly be it? I feel like I'm forgetting something, like nobody's business. Oh well. Remember, if you can't do, interview. See ya.